Today we are talking with Chitali, who is a senior program manager of inclusion recruiting at LinkedIn. I have so many questions to ask you about what you're doing, but before we go there, I do want to highlight that you have a really diverse background. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about where you've been and what do you see as the through line for your career?
Yeah, I do appreciate that I've had kind of two phases of career. So when I think about my background, I didn't have a through line, and then I did have a through line. Those are the two phases. So the through line for me is closing gaps of access. That's my thesis statement. That's the language I use when I introduce myself internally at LinkedIn. It's the language I use when I was interviewing for this role and previous roles. It served me well because it's a pretty direct response when people say, like, what do you do? I get to step back from what do I do? And I just say, like, this is the thing I care about. So my through line is closing gaps of access, knowing that that can look different in different spaces. It also gives me the flexibility to do different things. But more specifically, my first career was in consulting. So I used to work at Deloitte, and that's where I started my career. And uh, didn't didn't love what I did every day, which is fine. It was my first career. I gained a ton of skills. I'd learned a lot of tools. I use all those things now. So I have a lot of appreciation for that first phase of career. But that was, in fact, the inflection point, the transition that I'm so grateful for is that I got to start doing stuff that I cared deeply about after my first 3 years. I didn't have the language I used earlier about closing gaps of access then, but it's essentially the thing that I care deeply about. So I transitioned from consulting into community and education work through an Education Pioneers Fellowship. So I moved from Houston to Memphis at that time. And I worked with a variety of nonprofits in Memphis that were all, in one way or the other, trying to close gaps of access for young people in Memphis. And I worked predominantly with a early childhood education organization that was running the Head Start and early Head Start programming for the school district in Memphis. I got to support teachers. I got to just be in community and kind of doing whatever I can for this organization, bringing some of those tools, the data, the skills, the change management into that space. And after that, I came out to Haas for my MBA, continuing to try to search for what my work was going to be in this world. And that's where I started getting this language. That's where I started realizing that education was a space that I cared deeply about. But what is it about education that I was so passionate about? It was this idea that people have differential opportunity, and I have access and privilege and power in many ways. And how can I use those things to close those gaps for others who are phenomenal, who are talented, all those things, but didn't have the same opportunity? So education might still be one thing I do at some point in my career again. But it doesn't have to be the only thing that I do, which is what led me in the last few years to go back to Berkeley, work in diversity admissions for a couple of years, and then now be at LinkedIn, right? Completely different space, but very confidently I can still say I'm still living out that thesis, still living out that value system.
What a great phrase. It's great to have something like that that you can just have so much confidence about what you're doing.
Yeah, that's truly kind of what it feels like. It's a confidence builder. It's a coalition building phrase too. Like, people understand what I'm about when I say that. Obviously, I have to show up consistently and actually be about that. There's no substitute for it, but I like starting there. And I've introduced myself like that to a variety of people in the organization already, senior, junior, whatever you want to call it. And it's like, it feels so good to be able to put that out there. And people just at LinkedIn have said, yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Yeah, welcome. No one's surprised that I joined LinkedIn for that. No one's surprised. People are usually excited and want to get behind that because they usually have a similar mission or something adjacent. So it's a really good place to start a relationship and a conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know how anyone could be like, I can't get behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting any negative reaction, but it's been cool to see people is just kind of like, yeah, 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 that's right. Cool. Let's go.
That's great. Great. Well, that's a good segue into a little bit more of the like technical, what you do work in the inclusion recruiting space at LinkedIn. Maybe
Yeah.
tell me a little bit more about what is it that you do there and what does your day to day as a senior program manager look like?
Yeah. So I focus on partnerships and communities. That was the end of the official title. My official title is longer than I would ever put out there, right? But like senior program manager of inclusion, recruiting, communities, and partnerships. I like to say I work on inclusion, recruiting, partnerships. And so what I mean by that, before I get to what I do as a senior program manager specifically, is, our team, inclusion recruiting, it sits in LinkedIn's talent acquisition arm. We also have a diversity, inclusion, belonging team that sits under another part of our people org. We have a social impact team. We have a variety, we have a product equity team. We have a variety of people across the org who are focused on access and equity because it's part of our broader mission of economic empowerment. Inclusion recruiting exists as a team because I think it acknowledges that there's a special intersection of applying diversity, inclusion, belonging into the talent acquisition space specifically, knowing that representation, knowing that attrition and retention and development, all the things around people is such a key component, not the only component, but such a key component of an inclusion strategy for an organization. Inclusion recruiting exists because it's hard to have strategies and to execute and to have programs that will continue to increase the aperture for who gets access to incredible roles in a place like LinkedIn. And it's hard to build strategies for those lanes of access. So in a nutshell, what IR kind of does is across the entire recruiting landscape, from we met you all the way up here at the top of the funnel, all the way to we guided you through the process, and now you work here, we are creating inclusive strategies to bring in a representative pool of people, to make sure that our process is inclusive, everything from reducing bias to more actively having equity strategies. That's what our team does. My role as a senior program manager focused on the partnerships piece is that one of the ways we get to build that top of funnel, one of the ways that we get to really make sure we're meeting an incredibly diverse, wonderful community of people is through relationships and partnerships with organizations externally who are the best at what they do, which is to build trust, which is to cultivate community, create a space of maybe programming and bringing in resources, et cetera, right? I think a little bit of my background lends myself to super appreciate what that work means, to be able to cultivate that. And now I get to play this cool role from the LinkedIn side to do what maybe we do best. And that is to partner with these communities, to support them with, financially support them as part of the partnership, show up with the right resources, whether that's our people, whether that's trainings, whether that's LinkedIn platform and benefits through the actual organization, but show up in a way that says like, all right, we're going to meet you in this community of trust. We're going to cultivate relationships with you over time through a variety of different approaches. And then ultimately, whether you want to work here, whether you ultimately go somewhere else, whether you go somewhere else and then come back to work here one day, we want to help you understand your lanes. And if you want to work here, we're going to help you understand that there's amazing lanes of access to come work here. So my role as a senior program manager on all that is to move us slowly but surely, all of us forward, right? I have very little authority. I have a good deal of influence. So it's just one of those phrases, one of those skills, right? Influence without authority. That's what I get to practice all day, every day, is how do we get alignment from leadership? How do we get folks who are ultimately doing the sourcing and recruiting across all of our different business units to lean in on this work, to acknowledge the incredible potential of partnerships and communities for their space? And then how do I tell that story? Through data, through storytelling, through amplifying work. How do I tell the story in a way that creates this virtuous cycle and keeps us moving forward toward that goal of building really representative pools of people?
Amazing. I'm going to ask you something that's a little bit in the weeds. So you just told me all this like amazing stuff.
Let's get in the weeds.
Which like, I could go on so many tangents here. But what's interesting to me as you're talking about your work, and I'm thinking about like this conversation is, a little bit about like, what is program management? What is senior program management? When I think about that function, I'm thinking about it through the lens of a little bit of more traditional, like you're building out a program,
Yeah.
or you're managing a program over time. Whereas what you just described to me sounds much more like a partnerships role or like a business development role, where you're really kind of like you're you're getting out and making relationships with people. Where's the program aspect in?
I think the program aspect comes into play because, what are the components of any program? You have to understand your stakeholders, all the different people who are involved who might move something forward, understanding what resources you have or how you might unlock more resources to ultimately get to your goals. Usually comprised of several projects. Like, it's not so clean, I think, as like project management is here and then program management is here. I think sometimes those two things get mixed up, and that's okay. The way it shows up here is that I think about each partnership as a project, because there's a whole set of execution and expectations, but as a whole, all the projects together, plus the project of resource allocation and advocacy and stakeholder management and data and reporting, all those things combined towards the broader programmatic goal that I just described, that's what makes this an overall program. And so my job, I may have leaned in a little bit too much on like managing each partnership, which is part of it. And I don't necessarily own or manage or whatever word we want to use every single one, but that's part of the program management, which is who is going to manage it, right? Who is going to be the shepherd or the steward of this work going forward. I can influence those things through some of the tools. I can influence those things through some collaborative effort that I have to put into place for every single project that we execute. And as a whole, I guess I get to step back and say, IR partnerships as a program, here's what it looks like. Here's how we're doing. Here's where we need help. Here's where we're going to go. Right? I don't get into the weeds of every single project when I talk about that as a program, but I do think about a program as comprised of all these different components, and a program manager's job is to understand what those components are and to move things forward toward the goal.
You also mentioned like all these different players that you're interacting with, both within the organization as well as outside.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as kind of the primary stakeholders that you're working with in your role as a program manager?
All right, I want to say like the kind of heart forward thing first and say the candidate. Right. At the end of the day, we work in talent. So like our candidates are right front and center. And I would stand behind that. I'm going to give you a different answer as well, but I would stand behind that because at the end of the day, we are here to, again, create those lanes of access for candidates into our work. Partnerships exist to hopefully in our narrow view of them, to serve those candidates in finding those roles. We exist to support the partnerships, to support the candidate, right? So at the end of the day, there was a joke I once heard, like a total Bay Area joke, like every company is a consumer company, whether it's B2C or B2B2C or B2B to B2C, so you can technically make that claim everywhere. I think one of my main stakeholders in terms of how I spend my time and where I spend a lot of my like energy on is our talent teams, right? So we play kind of a center of excellence role at LinkedIn. And there's a variety of program managers, business partners, et cetera, on my team. Our job is to influence the folks who are actively managing funnels and pipelines of talent and recruiting and all the things that go along with bringing talent in officially. Our job is to support and influence and consult with them to build those strategies and to build where there's need and be strategic about it. So I do try to put like our talent acquisition teams right front and center, because if they're the ones who are going to ultimately have to activate on the things that we set up, then I need to make sure that they're fully equipped with the tools that they need. And those tools can be literal tools like the data or the access to platforms, et cetera, but it can also be they're equipped with the training and awareness of what this partnership is about. What community are you about to start engaging with? Why is it important to know that? How might that be different than doing some other direct sourcing or other strategies that you have? Right. So I spend a lot of my time putting the sourcers and recruiters right in my mind and saying, the thing that I'm building here, is it accessible both for the candidate from the partnership and for the sourcers and recruiters who will ultimately try to create those lanes and activate on those lanes? And have I done a good job of bringing those two parties together? It's necessarily kind of a connector role, because I don't do any active sourcing myself. I don't do recruiting myself. I'm not the hiring manager. And so what role do I play? I get to support all these different people. One role I'll just put out there, I'm giving you like 4 answers to a one question, but One role that I think can't be overlooked though is the people who are running these organizations externally, right? So when it comes to building partnership and like a multi-point engagement, hopefully we can do that with every candidate through that partnership, but more likely we'll do that with the partner itself, so that the partner starts associating us in their community, since they know their community best, since they cultivate the community. Their endorsement and their acknowledgement that LinkedIn is real about this stuff has been here consistently. That voice will go a lot further than every time we actually get to engage. So I also try to think about the people who work at these organizations who are going to be our ultimate advocates if we've done things right, as a measure of like, if I weren't there anymore, have things gone, have things maintained, or have they kind of fallen apart, right? I want to be able to do any job I do so that if I had to leave tomorrow, I've set the system up for success. And these are some of the key players I think that would have to be set up for success.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think sometimes, I'm not sure if we can go here, so you let me know, but I think sometimes like I hear that it makes sense to me, but also like it's a bit abstract, right? Like if you just have no knowledge of this space, you're like, okay, I hear what he's saying, but what does that look like actually? Like, can you give me an example of a partnership that you have externally that you feel really excited about and how that's creating a pipeline for people coming into the company?
Yeah, so we launched an exciting partnership at the beginning of this calendar year with an organization called codepath.org. So codepath.org is a bigger organization that has a broader mission around creating those lanes of access, funnels, development opportunities, et cetera, for students to find roles in technology, like computer science students and folks to kind of get into the engineering pathways, et cetera. Their bigger thesis being we need more development, we need more cultivated space to really prepare our young people. They launched a program within codepath.org called the ICP, Internship Connection Program, for 60 to 70 juniors in college who identify as Black, Latino, Latinx, or Native American, specifically who have never had a technical internship, but are computer science students. So they're searching for their first technical internship. And we were able to support them through a partnership. And what that meant was we had an engineering panel to kind of think about the awareness, right? Like what roles exist out there for me. We had recruiters and interview tips and tricks and resume workshops. We showed up to their open, what do they call them? Like the study hours, basically, to show up and be able to support students one-on-one. We're going to write a blog post celebrating this partnership. It's part of the partnership, right? Like amplifying what happened. And the idea here is we are investing as we can, showing up the resources in a partner's programming that they're putting together, because again, they know that best. And the outcome could be that some of these students come work at LinkedIn. We definitely want to create those lanes and make it super attractive. It could be that they go work elsewhere, but have this amazing experience with LinkedIn. So they'll tell people about it and have trust. Or they'll come back to work for us in 5 years. And we'll learn 5 years down the road that honestly, it was when I was in the ICP, when I was in college, that I first learned about LinkedIn. And it left such a great impression on me that I was always searching for a way to come back. Right. So there's all kinds of success stories that we can tell, because there are legitimately success stories for us. And it starts because we are building this relationship with the organization. We're trying to understand what they need from us. We're trying to show up consistently with the right people, the right resources that will, again, like with all the stakeholders I've named, support everyone in this journey. And similarly, like I mentioned, I'm working with our internal talent acquisition teams to make sure that they're well supported, to say, hey, we're partnering with this amazing organization. Here's what they're all about. Let me prepare you so you're set up for success. And now you're ready to come into these spaces and actively engage with these young people and be part of that journey into LinkedIn or wherever else they go.
Thanks for sharing that example. I think it's like, okay, I have like a picture, a story in my mind that's easier to understand. I guess as you're describing this as well, I'm hearing, not that it sounds complex, but it sounds like there's a lot going on and there is probably always more to do, right? And you're coming a little bit from most recently the education space. How do you see the difference between kind of coming out of education, higher ed, moving into tech at a larger tech company? Like, what is the pace and the culture of like keeping up with what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, the way the work shows up is that in higher ed, we all had distinct roles and we were all part of a small shop that was kind of responsible for everything. And so, my role was director of diversity admissions, which meant that my job meant at the MBA level across our MBA programs at Haas, I was responsible for influencing and building strategies, tools, lanes, et cetera, partnerships. Um, and I was reading applications, going to events, doing conferences, all that stuff. And it was great, right? I got to kind of see the breadth and depth of what recruiting can be in that world. I I'm part of a much bigger organization now, right? Whether higher ed or not, like I'm part of a much bigger organization, even just within talent acquisition. It's so big at LinkedIn, just like it's big at every major company. And so we all have more specialized roles, as you can imagine. So there are tons of program managers, project managers, et cetera, at LinkedIn that support in a variety of scaffolding ways all the active talent acquisition stuff that happens. I get to be really focused, even though what I'm saying sounds pretty broad, because I think it brings in a really broad set of people. At the end of the day, it's a focus on inclusion recruiting partnerships. I don't, I might do it because I want to, but I'm not expected to get involved with the day-to-day of talent acquisition work. I'm not expected to read applications. I'm not expected to review resumes, things like that. So in that sense, I get to be more focused, which is part of what I wanted, right? And the pace, the vibes, if you will, especially at LinkedIn, they're pretty similar for me so far. To some degree, like I'm not early in my career anymore, so there's a degree of self-regulation that I'm aware of. Like I also took this job with this company, knowing its culture, on this team, right? And I set some boundaries for myself, and I recognize the outcomes of those boundaries. Like when I was in consulting, for example, first career, I didn't have boundaries, and then I burnt out, just like a lot of people burn out. And here, I'm sure there are spaces within LinkedIn that people feel that way, for sure. So I can't speak for the whole company, but generally speaking, the focus on wellness, the incredible, like consistent focus on employee well-being and taking care of people so that, like we can give our best and yet do this for a long run is pretty phenomenal. It's tough to, I would imagine, match that anywhere. Like we're flexible. I work from home when I want to. I can go into the office when I want to. I get to take advantage of some of those kind of tech company benefits for the first time of whether it's things like free lunch, which is a huge deal, right? You don't know what you're missing until you have it. It's like, oh, free lunch, amazing. But also there's wellness benefits. There's funding if you need to do stuff that's more focused on your own well-being, et cetera. Like all those things come into play. And so far, all of those things impact the pace. They're not distinct. I think sometimes a company might have all those amazing benefits and perks, but you never get to really access them because your pace is just absurd, or because they're, when it gets real, that's not really real. Here so far, it's been really integrated, which is, maybe it's just my experience. I don't think it is though. I think it speaks to the culture.
Yeah. I don't know. You seem like pretty laid back fella, so it could be just your vibe.
Yeah, it's my vibe, but I designed for it too with what I get to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's cool because you mentioned so many different skills in there. Like previously you talked about influencing without authority, some of the stuff you're mentioning now, like career development skills of like boundary setting and you know, doing work that's really aligned with your values, right? Amongst, I'm sure there's lots of other things. I guess I'm curious. I always talk about when people take a new job, there's always going to be a place where you come in, you hit the ground running, and you feel confident that, like, I could do this with my eyes closed. I know this so well. And then there's always a place where you're going to have to get up to speed because you're taking on something you haven't done before. What would you say coming into this, you felt really confident about hitting the ground, and where you're like less confident and feeling like I really need to learn what's going on?
I felt confident about the content. I felt confident about how to approach partners and internal collaborators on this kind of work, recognizing you have to have some level of awareness, if not fluency, around inclusion. Not just, it's inclusion recruiting for a reason. Like we get to be great at that intersection. And so using that exact framework, the space I needed to ramp up on was recruiting, in the corporate space, in the tech space, understanding the world, understanding how big an engineering org is at a company like LinkedIn compared to the other parts of the organization. Um, so understanding the context is something I had to definitely build up, but the content, how I showed up, what I was talking about, what the best practices are, these are things that not only like that I feel pretty confident about, but so far have been very affirmed. Like this is what we needed, which feels great, right? It feels great when someone just acknowledges, okay, you have a level of confidence because you've done this. Sure, it was in a different space, but you know how to translate that into our world now because it's just a different context. And yeah, I can see you learning the context. I can see you putting the work in to really understand our world. That it's oversimplified, but I'm going to keep it there on purpose just to say I knew what I was doing in one way, and I knew what I needed to learn. And so far I've been able to work on both.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I see a lot of people struggle with that because they come into a new role and there's this feeling of like, I need to be able to get up to speed on like day one, but it never happens that quickly. I don't know, it seems like you just had a level of understanding that allowed you to kind of navigate that process more confidently.
Yeah, I mean, I have to acknowledge that the leap I made wasn't a leap across every single component of a new job, right? It was a big leap in the sense of like, I don't know if you call it industry or type of organization, going from higher education at UC to LinkedIn. That was a leap for sure. My role was focused on diversity admissions, and now it's inclusion recruiting. So in that sense, that's about as close as you can get from the higher ed to the corporate world on content and on functional expertise and experience. And look, I interviewed for tons of different jobs, a lot around the diversity inclusion space, kind of across the spectrum of what that would look like. I didn't get some of them, I got some of them, and I think the market to some degree spoke to me and said, hey, this job at LinkedIn is going to be amazing in a lot of different ways. And it's important that it's not a leap across a bunch of different parameters all at once. You get to still know what you're talking about to some degree because it's in the recruiting space, for example. And that showed up, right? Like as I mentioned at LinkedIn, we have a whole diversity, inclusion, belonging team that does everything from learning and development to coaching to data and best practices and all the other stuff you would expect a great DEI and DIBS team to do. And maybe I would have been good at that. I think I could have learned a lot, and I would have had a lot to learn because I had some context coming in. But I know inclusion recruiting better than I know some of those other spaces. And I think the market spoke to that and said, hey, you're actually pretty well qualified for this. And as I learned more about this job, I realized that's going to be an important success factor for me to make this leap, to have some sense of confidence at what they're expecting me to be able to accomplish.
I love that you mentioned that. The way I always explain it to people is there's you called it like components. I call it like the 4 different buckets of a career transition, or the location, the company, the industry, and the function. And like however many you're changing at a given time can indicate like how difficult your search is, how difficult it is to tell your story, and like how difficult it might be to onboard into something new. Because like, okay, I got to learn 4 new things at the same time.
Total. I mean, like I worked with some of the partners that I worked with at Haas, and I work with them now at LinkedIn. I was able to speak to that in the interview process, right? When they ask you questions about your experience, to be able to speak that common language, like that's helpful. There's no way to get around that. So I wasn't making a huge jump across 2 or 3 of those different buckets as you described them. It was really about one. It was like industry.
Cool. And you mentioned in there too, like, well, I was interviewing for lots of different things. I think sometimes when people are exploring, it's hard, right? Like companies might call the same job like different titles, or there's so many things that overlap. Like you mentioned, project management, program management are very similar. What are a couple of other roles that you were recruiting for that felt like, oh, this is still very similar to what I was doing or what I want to do?
Yeah. I think I put in like DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, whatever. These were my search keywords when I was looking for jobs, and I was kind of agnostic on the functional application of those. So a lot of it actually came back as program manager, project manager, success lead, implementation manager, stuff like that. there were some roles that were more focused, like at a bigger company, you're going to be able to say DEI, learning and development lead, right? That could be a very specific particular role. But once you get to that level, I think you have to have been able to show that you had some experience in learning and development for DEI somewhere before you're ready for that kind of a role at a bigger company. I found that at earlier stage companies, I didn't go for super tiny startups or anything, but middle startups all the way into kind of LinkedIn, there was some flexibility. And that was part of the evaluation process, that like you have to get in the conversation to understand what they mean when they say DEI program manager. Because I met companies where a DEI program manager was, reporting to the head of people, or I met some that were like 6 layers down from that, underneath a bunch of different other things. And you have to do that evaluation. What kind of influence and impact can you make from different parts of the organization with the exact same title at both those companies, even if those companies were similar size and everything else. Once you get into a bigger company like LinkedIn and beyond, there starts to be, I think, some degree of understanding, like, okay, what is a program manager? What's a senior program manager? What's a director? What's a senior director, et cetera? And especially coming from higher ed, I had to really wipe my slate clean, because my title was director at the last thing, but I knew that didn't translate. I just didn't know to what degree it didn't translate, and I had to kind of reset expectations. But once you get into the conversation, it feels more relevant. I guess if I'm giving unsolicited advice around that specific thing, I would say, don't let the title thing stop you. Let the market kind of respond and say, hey, you might be a little too junior for this, or get into a conversation, realize you're a little too senior for this, advocate for yourself. And if the company has the opportunity to up level that role, then great. And if not, that's okay too. That's the market speaking to you. But honestly, that's why I kind of lean into program management. It is a general term that allows you to, I think, bring your skill set and apply it in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, especially when I was looking back through your background and your profile, like there's just so many themes of operations and management, program management, project management. And it's like, if you have those skills of like, the skills we talked about very early on in this conversation, I think it could apply to a lot of different functional titles.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, cool. Well, I know you're doing such amazing work. I want to end with one question. You talked about how much connecting you're already doing in your work, but I'm a big fan of connecting with people. And so, who would you like to connect with personally in the next year to come?
I want to first meet with other people doing what I'm doing. At LinkedIn, it's a very built out role now, but it's the first time they've had it, and I don't see this kind of role everywhere. The reactions I've gotten from some of my colleagues and peers elsewhere, it's kind of like, yeah, we do that work, but it's kind of interesting that LinkedIn has said there should be a position for it. And so whether there's other people with this position or other people who just do it in their broader portfolio of work, it's niche in some ways, and I want to just meet other folks who are doing this work so I can learn from them, and we can kind of build plans together. And I think the bigger reason why that matters is I don't want to just like grab a slice of the pie for LinkedIn. That's my secondary, if not further down goal. My bigger goal is, through this work, we create a much, much bigger pie, and kind of raise awareness and understanding that this work, inclusion recruiting, matters so much that we all need to open our apertures way more, so that we're totally kind of rethinking who we consider as qualified, highly qualified talent, right? So if I'm able to engage with other folks doing this work, I would be so happy to build that coalition and try to build some kind of cross-company strategies, whether they're formal or just under the table, to say, like, what are we doing to actually transform the overall space, so that these 5 companies aren't just, we've all heard the phrases, right? Like trading amazing talent or playing back and forth, whatever it is. Like, that's not the end game that I'm going for here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that and for sharing your experience. And like I said, you're doing some amazing work. I'm sure you know that, but keep it up. Let me know if I can support you in any way. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks for giving me the space to share. Yeah, hopefully this was helpful.